In the quiet hills of Ireland, people still talk about a sound that chills the blood. It isn't thunder or the wind or any living thing. It comes without warning, soft at first, then rising like grief itself. Old families say when it's heard, someone's fate has already been sealed. No one dares to follow the sound, because those who did never liked what they found. Behind that cry lies something deeper than fear. It carries the weight of memory, of loss, of a people who turn sorrow into legend. To understand it is to meet the Bean-Sidhe, not just a ghost, but a voice echoing through centuries of Irish life. Through her, we see how cultures face grief, preserve identity, and find meaning in the hardest moments of being human. The Bean-Sidhe, pronounced Banshee, is a supernatural woman whose cry warns certain Irish families of an approaching death. She's not trying to cause harm. She arrives early to keen for the departed before they've even left this world. Think of her as grief personified, sorrow given voice and form. The name itself reveals layers of meaning. Bean means woman. Sidhe refers to those ancient earthen mounds scattered across the Irish countryside. These weren't random hills. These were burial places, sacred sites, doorways to the other world in pre-Christian Irish belief. The fairy mounds, when we say Bean-Sidhe, we're saying woman of those liminal spaces, woman who dwells in the threshold between life and death, between the mortal world and the realm beyond. References to supernatural women who mourn the dead appear in some of the oldest Irish literature we have, texts from the 8th and 9th centuries. A Calam na Senorach, Tales of the Elders, is a massive collection of stories supposedly told by ancient warriors to St. Patrick himself. In these tales, we find mentions of otherworldly women who appear before great heroes die, who are keen and wail at the passing of noble souls. Another early text, Cath Cluain Tab, describes fairy women lamenting before a battle. These aren't casual mentions. These are woven into the fabric of the stories, treated as natural and expected. When a great person was about to die, certain women from the other world would make their presence known. The early Irish, before St. Patrick brought Christianity in the 5th century, believed in a race of supernatural beings called the Tuatha De Danann. This name means the people of the goddess Danu, and they were thought to be the original divine inhabitants of Ireland. When human settlers arrived, the Tuatha De Danann went underground, literally, dwelling in those fairy mounds. They became the fairy folk, powerful and dangerous. The Bean-Sidhe seems to have emerged from this tradition. She was likely understood as one of these otherworldly women, connected to the Tuatha De Danann, who maintained a link with certain mortal families, perhaps because those families descended from the Tuatha De Danann themselves, perhaps because of ancient pacts or marriages between mortal and fairy. In traditional Irish culture, there was a practice called keening. The Irish word is caoinead, and it refers to a specific type of vocal lamentation performed at funerals. This wasn't quiet, dignified crying. This was loud, rhythmic, musical wailing. It was formalized grief, grief as performance and ritual, almost exclusively performed by women. Keening served multiple purposes. It helped the bereaved express their overwhelming sorrow in socially acceptable ways. It honored the dead with the intensity of emotion displayed. It marked the transition from life to death with sound, filling the air with human acknowledgement of loss. In many Irish communities, there were even professional keeners, women known as Bean Cointe, who would be hired to mourn at funerals. Professional mourners, women whose job was to cry beautifully and powerfully for the dead. Imagine you're in rural Ireland 1,000 years ago. You hear a woman keening in the night. But when you look, no funeral is happening. The sound seems to come from nowhere, from the darkness itself, from the old mound at the edge of the village. Many folklorists believe the Bean-Sidhe legend may have preserved the memory of these professional mourning women, transforming them over time into something supernatural. The human Bean-Sidhe became the fairy Bean-Sidhe. The mortal mourner became an immortal one. Real women who cried for the dead became a spirit woman who cries before the dead, warning families of what's to come. This theory makes sense when you consider how oral traditions work. Stories change, details shift, reality and fantasy blend together over generations until you can't quite separate them anymore. The connection between Keening and the Bean-Sidhe is deep and undeniable. Both are about women, grief, and the power of the human voice to mark death's approach and passing. The Bean-Sidhe isn't a monster. She doesn't cause death. She announces it. She mourns it. In a way, she's actually a comforting figure. She says that your death matters, that your family matters, that someone, even if it's a fairy woman from an ancient mound, cares enough to cry for you. As Ireland transitioned from paganism to Christianity, starting in the 5th century and continuing for centuries afterward, the Bean-Sidhe belief didn't disappear. It adapted. Christianity didn't erase the old beliefs. It absorbed them, reinterpreted them, wove them into a new Christian framework. The fairy mounds remained sacred, but they became dangerous in new ways. The Tuatha De Danann became fallen angels or nature spirits that good Christians should avoid. Some Christian interpreters suggested she might be a fallen angel who wasn't quite evil enough for hell, but not pure enough for heaven. Others thought she might be the ghost of a woman who had some connection to the family and life. The Church never officially endorsed belief in the Bean-Sidhe, but it never completely stamped it out either. Throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era, the Bean-Sidhe belief became increasingly linked to specific noble bloodlines. She didn't appear for just anyone. She was connected to ancient Gaelic families, families who could trace their ancestry back to the kings and chieftains of pre-Christian Ireland. This selectivity makes sense when you remember her likely origins as a fairy woman connected to the Tuatha De Danann. By the 17th century, when folklore began to be more systematically recorded, the Bean-Sidhe was firmly established in Irish tradition. Writers and collectors started documenting which families were supposed to have their own Bean-Sidhe, what she looked like, how she sounded when she appeared. Consider how remarkable this persistence is. We have a belief that persisted for over 1,000 years, evolving but never dying, adapting to new religious frameworks while maintaining its essential character. The Bean-Sidhe survived the transition from paganism to Christianity, from Gaelic chieftains to English occupation, from medieval Ireland to the modern era. That kind of persistence tells us something important. This belief was meeting some deep psychological or cultural need. What was that need? It's about control in the face of the uncontrollable. Death is terrifying partly because it's so sudden, so final, so unpredictable. Except, in the world of the Bean-Sidhe, death does give warnings. Her cry gives you notice. Maybe just hours, but still, notice. You can prepare. You can say goodbye. There's also something about identity and belonging wrapped up in this belief. If your family has a Bean-Sidhe, that means you're part of something old and significant. Your ancestors matter. Your lineage means something. In a world where Irish culture and identity were constantly under threat, having a Bean-Sidhe was a way of asserting that your family's story stretched back into the mists of time. The Bean-Sidhe is a symbol of cultural continuity. She's a thread connecting modern Irish people to their pre-Christian ancestors. She's proof that something of the old world survived, that the stories didn't die, that memory can outlast conquest and conversion. Understanding these origins helps us see why the Bean-Sidhe isn't just a quaint superstition. She's a complex cultural symbol that tells us about Irish history, about how oral traditions evolve, about the relationship between belief and practice, about identity and memory and grief. Having traced her beginnings, we can now explore which families were said to possess their own Bean-Sidhe. The Bean-Sidhe was believed to attach herself only to ancient Gaelic families of pure Irish descent. In the Irish context, this meant families who could trace their lineage back to the pre-Norman invasion period, before 1169. These were families who descended from the old Gaelic nobility, the tribal kings and chieftains who ruled Ireland when the island was divided into scores of small kingdoms. The surnames matter enormously. Certain names were understood to have Bean-Sidhe connections: O'Brien, O'Connor, O'Neill, O'Donnell, McCarthy, Kavanagh, and Maguire. These weren't just any families. These were descendants of the most powerful dynasties in Irish history. Take O'Brien. This family claimed descent from Brian Boru, the most famous of all Irish high kings, the man who united Ireland against Viking invaders and died heroically at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. The O'Briens ruled Thomond in what's now County Clare for centuries. Having a Bean-Sidhe reinforced their status. It said, "Even the fairy folk acknowledge our importance." The O'Neills were the premier dynasty of Ulster, claiming descent from Niall of the Nine Hostages, a legendary high king from around the 4th century. The O'Connors were the royal family of Connaught, the Western Province. The O'Donnells ruled Tyrconnell in what's now County Donegal. Each of these families had centuries of history, genealogies memorized and recited by professional bards, and a Bean-Sidhe who marked their deaths. In pre-Norman Ireland, genealogy was everything. Your family determines your status, your rights, your property. Professional genealogists called Seancheda memorized vast family trees going back generations. Within this context, having a Bean-Sidhe was another form of genealogical proof. It said, "Our family is so old, so important, that the fairy folk themselves have assigned us a guardian mourner." The systematic recording of these beliefs began during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Thomas Crofton Croker published Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland in 1825. He travelled through Munster, interviewing people, collecting stories, and writing them down with accuracy. His work on the Bean-Sidhe was particularly detailed. Lady Jane Wilde, Oscar Wilde's mother, published Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland. In 1887, she was deeply invested in preserving Irish culture and identity at a time when both were under threat. Her collection includes numerous Bean-Sidhe accounts, always carefully noting which family was involved. The traditional belief was that she would appear or wail before the death of a family member. The timing was important. The Bean-Sidhe typically appeared or made herself heard shortly before the death, anywhere from a few hours to a day or two in advance. This gave the belief a testable quality. If you heard the Bean-Sidhe tonight, you could check tomorrow if someone in the family had died. According to folklore, if more than one Bean-Sidhe was heard, that signified the approaching death of someone of great status. Multiple Bean-Sidhes wailing together. This would be reserved for chieftains, for bishops, for anyone whose death would impact many people. This detail created a hierarchy even in death omens, reinforcing social stratification, while acknowledging that certain deaths mattered more to the community as a whole. Some family traditions claimed their Bean-Sidhe could be heard in different counties at the same time. This suggested she wasn't a physical being who had to travel from place to place. She was something spiritual, something that could manifest in multiple locations if needed. What did it mean, psychologically and culturally, to believe your family had a Bean-Sidhe? On one hand, it's a source of pride. Your family is special. On the other hand, it's also a source of dread. Every strange sound in the night might be her. You live with the knowledge that supernatural grief is watching your family. Perhaps that weight was the point. Perhaps living with awareness of death. Living with the knowledge that your family is marked by a mourner who will cry for you. Perhaps that kept death present in a way that was ultimately necessary. Traditional Irish culture, with the Bean-Sidhe watching, didn't have the luxury of hiding death. These families maintained their Bean-Sidhe traditions even as Ireland changed around them. The Norman invasion, the Tudor conquest, the Cromwellian wars, the Williamite wars, the penal laws, the Great Famine, all of these catastrophes shook Irish society. Yet the Bean-Sidhe belief persisted. Families that lost their lands, their titles, their wealth, still maintained that they had their Bean-Sidhe. The English could confiscate your property, but they couldn't confiscate your fairy mourner. This persistence speaks to the psychological importance of the belief. It was a form of resistance. It said, "You may have defeated us politically and economically, but we're still who we are. Our identity goes deeper than land ownership." Having seen which families claimed the Bean-Sidhe, we need to understand what she actually sounded like. People heard something. Hundreds of people over hundreds of years reported hearing strange, mournful sounds in the night, sounds they couldn't explain, sounds that seemed to precede death. The descriptions vary wildly, which tells us something about how folklore works, how perception works, how the interaction between expectation and experience creates the stories we tell. Some people described Bean-Sidhe's cry as a low, continuous mourning, similar to the sound of keeners at a funeral. Keening was a real practice. People knew what it sounded like. Professional mourners would wail in a rhythmic, musical way. If you heard that sound in the night, coming from no identifiable source, floating across dark fields, you would absolutely stop cold. That's keening. But there's no funeral happening. Where is that coming from? Other descriptions are completely different. Some people reported a shrill cry, more like a scream than a song, resembling a fox's screech or wind whistling through stone ruins. This is much more unsettling. There's nothing beautiful about it. It's pure distress, pure anguish. Both descriptions could easily have natural explanations. Wind, animals, maybe someone mourning at a distance. But if you're primed to hear the Bean-Sidhe, if you've grown up with stories about her, then those natural sounds get reinterpreted through the lens of belief. This doesn't mean people were lying. It means human perception is complicated. We don't just passively receive sensory information. We actively interpret it based on our expectations, our knowledge, our cultural frameworks. The same sound could be heard by one person as wind, and by another person as the Bean-Sidhe. The cry was reported to carry for 1 to 2 miles in still air. Sound travels differently depending on atmospheric conditions, temperature, humidity, terrain. Irish geography lends itself to these acoustic tricks. The landscape is full of valleys, hills, bodies of water, all of which can reflect and amplify sound in strange ways. Add fog, which is common in Ireland, and you have a situation where sounds become disembodied, directionless. The Bean-Sidhe was most often heard at night. Night is when we're already more attuned to fear, when our vision is limited and we rely more on hearing. Night is also when you're more likely to hear animals like foxes, when wind patterns change, when temperature shifts create acoustic oddities. She was particularly associated with running water and ancient ring forts. Both of these locations have significance in Irish folklore. Running water is a threshold, a boundary between here and there. Ring forts are deeply connected to fairy belief. Many are ancient, dating back over 1,000 years. They were originally defensive structures, but in folklore they became associated with the fairy folk. From the 1930s through the 1950s, the Irish Folklore Commission conducted systematic collection work. They accumulated an enormous archive, full of Bean-Sidhe accounts. What's striking is how many include detailed descriptions of the sound itself. The sound was usually sustained rather than brief. It lasted long enough for the hearer to really register it. It had an emotional quality. People consistently describe it as sorrowful, mournful, filled with grief. In some counties, particularly Limerick and Clare, there was a belief that 3 cries meant 3 deaths within a household. This is a darker variant. Instead of 1 death being warned of, you're being told that death will come 3 times. This detail shows how the Bean-Sidhe belief was locally variable. Different regions had different specifics. Think about what it means to hear something you can't explain at night, when you're alone or with your family in a small house, when the nearest neighbors might be a mile away. You hear a cry, a wail, something that sounds like profound human grief. But there's no funeral, no reason anyone should be making that sound. Your mind reaches for the explanations your culture has provided. The Bean-Sidhe. Once that thought enters your mind, it's almost impossible to shake. You're waiting. You're anticipating. Every hour that passes, you're thinking, who will it be? When will it happen? That psychological state, that suspension between warning and fulfillment, is almost worse than grief itself. Then someone dies. A family member takes ill and passes. Suddenly, the sound you heard makes complete sense. It was her. The belief is confirmed. The pattern holds. You'll remember this for the rest of your life, and you'll tell others about it. People didn't just hear a sound and think someone's going to die. They felt something. They described being moved, being shaken, being filled with dread or sorrow. The cry affected them viscerally, physically. Their hearts raced. Their skin prickled. The Bean-Sidhe cry was often heard by multiple people at once. Accounts frequently mention waking family members, having them listen, everyone agreeing that yes, they hear it. This social confirmation is crucial. If you're alone and you hear something strange, you might doubt yourself. But if 5 people hear the same thing, doubt becomes much harder. The Irish Folklore Commission archives preserve accounts where people described not just hearing the cry, but how it made them feel and what they did in response. Some lit candles and said prayers. Some called in neighbors to keep vigil. These responses show that the Bean-Sidhe belief wasn't passive. It prompted action. The cry also served as a form of communication within families and communities. If word spread that the Bean-Sidhe had been heard, neighbors would know to be ready to help. They'd prepare to assist with the wake, the funeral arrangements. Irish geography shapes sound in distinctive ways. Hills create echoes. Valleys funnel and amplify. Water reflects and carries. The prevalence of stone affects how sound travels and reverberates. Ireland is a place where sound does strange things, where acoustic illusions are common. Night was very dark and very quiet for most of Irish history. No streetlights, no traffic. Once the sun set, you were in real darkness with real quiet. In that environment, any unusual sound becomes magnified. The cry of the Bean-Sidhe is the emotional heart of the legend. It's what people remembered. It's what terrified them. Long after the details of her appearance might fade or vary, the memory of that cry remained vivid. But the cry wasn't her only manifestation. Sometimes she was seen, and those visual encounters added another layer to the legend. The Bean-Sidhe wasn't just a sound. Sometimes she was seen. Those descriptions varied dramatically depending on where in Ireland you were. This regional variation shows us how a single belief can fragment into multiple versions as it spreads across different communities. In Leinster, the eastern province, Bean-Sidhe was often described as a young woman, beautiful even, with long red hair. She wore white, or sometimes pale green. A young, beautiful woman in white. That's different from what you might expect for a death omen. She's not hideous, she's lovely, but in an otherworldly way. Red hair has special significance in Irish folklore. It was considered unusual, marked. People with red hair were sometimes thought to have fairy blood. A Bean-Sidhe with red hair makes her fairy nature explicit. The white or pale green dress reinforces this otherworldly quality. White is the colour of death in many cultures. Pale green is the colour of fairy folk. Seeing this young, beautiful woman in white would be disorienting. She doesn't match your expectations. She should be frightening, but she's lovely. That contradiction creates unease. Beauty mixed with dread is more unsettling than simple horror. Move to Munster, the southern province, and the description changes entirely. In Munster, the Bean-Sidhe was more often described as an elderly woman with grey hair and red eyes from crying. She wore a cloak, usually grey or black. This version is much more than what you'd expect. She looks like a mourner. Red eyes are a detail that recurs across many accounts. Eyes swollen and reddened from weeping. This makes her sorrow visible. She's been crying forever. She'll cry forevermore. The cloak is interesting. Cloaks were common garments in Ireland for centuries. But a cloak also obscures. It hides the body. A woman in a cloak seen at night or in fog would be more suggestive than a solid figure. In Connaught, the western province, we get yet another variant. Here the Bean-Sidhe sometimes appears as a washerwoman figure, known as the Bean-Sidhe. She's found at fords, at crossing places in streams, and she's washing clothes or armour. But these aren't regular clothes. They're blood-stained. She's washing the grave clothes of the person about to die. This image is deeply unsettling. A woman washing blood-stained clothes at night, at a river ford, predicting death through the act of cleaning. The ford is a threshold. Water is purification, but also danger. Washing clothes is domestic work, but washing blood and grave clothes turns that familiar task into something sinister. The Bean-Sidhe appears in Scottish folklore as well, which makes sense given the close cultural connections between Ireland and Scotland. Wales has a comparable figure called the Caerhirith. The Celtic regions formed a network of interconnected folklore. The earliest visual description we have comes from a 14th century tale involving the O'Brien family. The tale describes a hag of the mist who was heard crying before deaths in the family. She's ancient, associated with mist and fog. This 14th century reference shows the belief was already well established and detailed by that time. As we move into the 18th century, accounts become more detailed. Witnesses claimed she floated above the ground, her feet not touching earth. Others said she disappeared instantly after wailing. These details mark her as supernatural beyond any doubt. Humans don't float. Humans can't vanish instantly. The variation in physical descriptions across regions tells us how folklore develops and spreads. The core idea remains constant, but the details change based on local culture, local landscape, and local history. Each region essentially created the Bean-Sidhe in their own image. Think about what happens when someone in Leinster, who's heard all their life about the beautiful young woman in white, sees an actual young woman in white clothes at night. Their mind will make the connection instantly. You see what you expect to see, what you've been trained to see. Some of the most interesting accounts describe the Bean-Sidhe as appearing directly before verified deaths, not days before, but hours or even minutes before. Someone sees her outside a house, and the next morning, someone in that house has died in the night. Memory is fallible. Stories get shaped in the telling. If someone dies, and that night someone thinks back and remembers maybe hearing something odd, that memory can get strengthened until it becomes certain. Also, in communities where belief in the Bean-Sidhe was strong, people were probably primed to notice and remember unusual sights and sounds whenever death occurred. The physical descriptions also reflect changing fashions and styles over centuries. In earlier accounts, she wears cloaks and simple dresses. Later accounts sometimes mention shawls or other garments that came into fashion in the 18th and 19th centuries. If the Bean-Sidhe is a spiritual being, an entity that manifests in ways humans can perceive and interpret, then she would naturally appear in forms that are culturally comprehensible. She'd look like what people expect death omens to look like. The regional variants remind us that Ireland, despite being a small island, is not and was never culturally uniform. Different provinces had their own distinct traditions. The Bean-Sidhe belief spread across this varied landscape and became multiple related but distinct traditions. Having seen what the Bean-Sidhe looked like across Ireland's provinces, we need to examine specific instances where her appearance or cry was followed by death. The Bean-Sidhe belief persisted not just because it was a good story, but because people kept experiencing things they interpreted as her, and those experiences seemed to be followed by death often enough to maintain the pattern. We'll start with the most legendary death in Irish history, Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. According to chroniclers, writing shortly after the event, there was a fairy woman's wail heard before the battle. We have to be careful here. These chroniclers were writing years or decades after the event, creating a particular narrative about Brian's importance. Including supernatural omens was a standard literary technique. But what we can say is that by the time these chronicles were written, the idea that a fairy woman would wail before the death of a great Irish king was already established enough to be used as a literary device. The belief was already there, already understood by the audience. Moving forward several centuries, we come to Lady Fanshaw's memoirs from 1642. Anne Fanshawe was an Englishwoman married to a diplomat. She travelled with him to Ireland during the turbulent period of the Irish Rebellion. She wasn't Irish. She had no cultural investment in Bean-Sidhe belief. In her memoir, she described staying at a castle in Ireland and hearing a terrible wailing sound in the night. She was frightened and confused. The next morning, she learned that her host had died during the night. Later, she was told that this was the Banshee. She recorded this in her memoir as a strange Irish custom she'd witnessed. What makes this account valuable is Lady Fanshaw's outsider status. She wasn't primed to hear the Bean-Sidhe. She didn't grow up with stories about her. When she heard something strange, her first thought wasn't, "Oh, that's the Banshee." It was only afterward that she understood what she was supposed to have witnessed. 18th century Dublin newspapers include occasional reports of unexplained lamentations heard before noble deaths. These are brief notices, noting that strange sounds were heard at such and such location before Lord so-and-so passed away. One specific case from 1642 involves Charles O'Neill. According to records, servants heard cries under his window one night. They went to investigate but found nothing. A few hours later, Charles O'Neill died unexpectedly in his sleep. The servants immediately understood what they'd heard. This case has several interesting elements. Multiple witnesses heard the same thing. The cries were heard very close to the time of death, just hours before. The death, while not necessarily suspicious, was unexpected enough to be notable. The 19th century is when folklore collection really took off, and we get an explosion of recorded Bean-Sidhe accounts. Collectors documented more than 40 separate family-linked prophecies where the Bean-Sidhe was heard or seen before a death. What's striking about these 19th century collections is the consistency of the pattern. Over and over we get unexplained sound or apparition, followed within hours or days by a death in a family traditionally linked to the Bean-Sidhe. Skeptics would point out that people die all the time. In large extended families, someone was probably always dying somewhere. So if you hear a strange sound and then cast around for a death to connect it to, you'll probably find one if you look hard enough. Believers would counter that the Bean-Sidhe tradition specifically predicted deaths within the family, not random deaths in the community. And many accounts specify that the death followed very quickly, within 24 hours. That common detail appears across many accounts. The wail was typically heard within 24 hours before the death. This timing is important. It's specific enough to be testable, but broad enough to be plausible. Multiple witnesses hearing or seeing the same thing appears in many accounts. One person seeing or hearing something strange can be dismissed as individual hallucination. But when several people all hear the same cry, all see the same figure, dismissal becomes harder. One fascinating aspect of many accounts is that the Bean-Sidhe was often heard or seen by people who didn't know they were part of a family with a Bean-Sidhe tradition. A servant might hear something, or a visitor, or a young child who hadn't been told the family stories yet. The prophetic occurrences span from the 11th century to the 19th and even 20th centuries. That's a remarkable time span for a belief to maintain not just in general, but in specific predictive detail. Every time someone heard the Bean-Sidhe and a death followed, that became a story. That got told at wakes, at family gatherings. Those stories accumulated over centuries into a massive body of testimony that seemed, to believers, to prove the pattern beyond doubt. Imagine knowing that your family has a Bean-Sidhe. Every strange sound at night makes you wonder. You're always, at some level, waiting for her, listening for her. And when someone does die, you think back. Did anyone hear anything? This creates a heightened awareness of mortality that's mostly absent from modern secular life. We try to forget about death until it's unavoidable. But in traditional Irish culture, with the Bean-Sidhe watching, death was always present. The recorded prophetic occurrences, whether we believe they were supernatural or natural, all point to one undeniable truth. People believed. They believed enough to pay attention, to record experiences, to pass stories down through generations. But who or what was the Bean-Sidhe really? To understand what people thought she actually was, we need to look at the various interpretations that developed. Over the centuries, Irish culture developed several competing and sometimes complementary answers to the fundamental question, what is she? The first and probably oldest interpretation roots the Bean-Sidhe in pre-Christian Irish paganism. In this view, she's a manifestation of Morrigan, one of the most powerful goddesses in Irish mythology. The Morrigan was associated with battle, fate, death, and sovereignty. She appeared before great battles, washing the armour and weapons of those about to die. The connection between the Morrigan and the Bean-Sidhe is strong. Both are supernatural women associated with death. Both appear before deaths occur, functioning as omens. Both have connections to washing, to water, to the act of preparing for death. If the Bean-Sidhe is indeed a folk memory of the Morrigan, that would make her very old. The Morrigan appears in some of the earliest Irish mythological texts. When Christianity came, these gods didn't vanish from people's minds. They transformed, became the fairy folk. The Bean-Sidhe, in this interpretation, is the Morrigan diminished but not destroyed, reduced from a goddess to a fairy woman, but still performing her ancient function. She still watches over death. Christianity couldn't erase her, so she adapted. This interpretation gives the Bean-Sidhe immense depth and history. She's not just a ghost story. She's a goddess still active in the world. There's another interpretation, equally well established. This one suggests the Bean-Sidhe is the ghost of a woman who once served or was related to the family she's attached to. Perhaps she was a devoted servant who loved the family so much that even death couldn't break her connection to them. Perhaps she was an ancestress. This interpretation makes the Bean-Sidhe more personal. She's not a goddess or a general fairy being. She's your Bean-Sidhe, the spirit of someone who was once human, once part of your family story. Her grief is personal grief. Some family traditions specified who their Bean-Sidhe had been in life. She was great-aunt so-and-so, who died young and promised to watch over the family. These specific origin stories gave the Bean-Sidhe identity beyond just being a supernatural omen. This interpretation probably developed as Christianity became more dominant in Ireland. The pre-Christian gods became uncomfortable for people trying to be good Christians, but ghosts were more acceptable. The church taught that souls continued after death, that the dead could appear to the living under certain circumstances. Then there's the explicit Christian reinterpretation. In this view, the Bean-Sidhe is a fallen angel, not a demon, exactly, but a spiritual being who fell from grace yet wasn't evil enough for damnation. Instead, she exists in a liminal state, allowed to warn the living about approaching death. Alternatively, some Christian interpreters suggested the Bean-Sidhe might be a wandering soul, someone who died, but whose soul hasn't yet reached its final destination. She's in purgatory, perhaps, working out her salvation by performing this service for the living. These Christian interpretations allowed educated believers to maintain belief in the Bean-Sidhe without intellectual contradiction. They could believe in both Christ and the crying woman. All three of these interpretations coexisted throughout Irish history. People didn't sit down and decide which interpretation was correct. Different families, different regions, different individuals held different beliefs about what she was. Many people probably held multiple interpretations simultaneously. This multiplicity of interpretation is characteristic of folklore. Beliefs aren't handed down in fixed, dogmatic forms. They're fluid, adaptable, capable of holding contradictions. Her consistent association with the Sidhe, with the fairy mounds, reinforces her pre-Christian roots. Connecting the Bean-Sidhe to them placed her firmly in the oldest layer of Irish belief. Yet she also connects to the Christian tradition of keening, that formalized mourning. Keening was accepted by the church, even if sometimes viewed with suspicion. Perhaps the Bean-Sidhe is simply the personification of grief itself, not a specific being, goddess or ghost or angel, but the embodiment of a cultural practice and a universal human emotion. Grief is real. Mourning is necessary. The Bean-Sidhe might be Ireland's way of giving grief a face, a voice. This interpretation doesn't require supernatural belief. it operates on a metaphorical or psychological level. The Bean-Sidhe is real as a cultural symbol, as an expression of collective emotion. What unites all these interpretations is that they all understand the Bean-Sidhe as fundamentally connected to the other world. She comes from somewhere else. She crosses boundaries that usually hold firm. She brings messages from realms we can't see or understand. This otherness is essential to her power and meaning. We need figures who stand outside normal reality to help us process events that feel like they break normal reality. Death breaks reality for us. The Bean-Sidhe's identity is multiple, layered, complex. She's goddess and ghost. She's pagan and Christian. She's whatever her believers need her to be. And she's remained powerful precisely because she's flexible enough to be reinterpreted across centuries. But the Bean-Sidhe doesn't exist in isolation. She's part of a larger network of Irish death omens. The Bean-Sidhe is the most famous Irish death omen, but she's far from the only one. Irish folklore is rich with signs, portents, and supernatural warnings about approaching death. Understanding this broader tradition helps us see how the Bean-Sidhe fits into a comprehensive worldview where death doesn't come unannounced. Dogs howling under windows was one of the most widespread omens. If a dog, especially one that normally didn't howl, suddenly started howling under someone's window at night, that was a bad sign. Death was coming to that house. The dog could sense it, could smell it perhaps, or could see things humans couldn't. This belief isn't unique to Ireland. Many cultures associate howling dogs with death. Dogs are sensitive to changes in their environment and in people. They might detect subtle signs that someone is dying before humans notice. But in the Irish tradition, this gets interpreted through a supernatural lens. The dog isn't just detecting physical changes. The dog is seeing the approach of death itself. Mirrors falling or breaking was another common omen. Mirrors have always been mysterious objects. They show you yourself but reversed. They capture light and image in ways that seem almost magical. In many cultures, mirrors are believed to contain or trap souls. In Irish tradition, a mirror breaking or falling in someone's presence meant their death was approaching. The mirror was showing you your fate. Or perhaps the mirror, as a threshold object, was registering the presence of death itself. Candles or clocks stopping at the moment of death was another widespread omen. The candle gutters and goes out, or the clock suddenly stops at the exact instant someone dies. This was understood as the soul departing. The person's life force was so strong that it affected nearby objects. Time itself stopped for that person, so their clock stopped too. Birds, especially certain species, carried ominous meanings when they entered houses. A robin or a crow flying into your house was a death omen. Birds were seen as messengers between worlds. They fly, inhabiting both earth and sky, living in spaces humans can't easily reach. These common omens existed alongside the Bean-Sidhe belief. They were part of a comprehensive system of death divination. People paid attention to multiple signs, multiple layers of warning. The supernatural world was understood as communicating constantly. What made the Bean-Sidhe special was how personalized she was. A dog might howl before any death. A mirror might break for any reason related to death. But the Bean-Sidhe was specifically linked to your family. She didn't appear for everyone. That made her a more intimate omen. In some parts of Ireland, particularly regions with strong Scottish connections, there was a belief in the fetch, a ghostly double of a living person. Seeing your own fetch was a sign you would die soon. Seeing someone else's fetch meant they would die soon. Wales had the Sairith, that supernatural mourner whose cry foretold death. The Isle of Man had similar traditions. The Celtic regions formed a network of interconnected folklore where beliefs spread and influenced each other. What was it about death that these traditions were addressing? It comes down to control and meaning. Death is the ultimate loss of control. You can't prevent it. You can't bargain with it. That randomness, that inevitability combined with unpredictability is terrifying. Death omens give back a tiny measure of control. They don't let you prevent death, but they let you know it's coming. That knowledge is still a form of power. You can prepare. You can say goodbyes. The omens also give death meaning. They say that death matters enough for the supernatural world to notice, to send signs. Your death isn't just biological failure. It's an event significant enough to ripple through multiple layers of reality. Irish death omen traditions persisted in rural areas well into the 20th century. The beliefs reinforced themselves through lived experience. Someone hears a dog howl, and 3 days later, someone in that house dies. The connection is made. The story gets told. This is pattern recognition, meaning-making. The human mind doing what it evolved to do, finding connections and building frameworks for understanding the world. The Bean-Sidhe sits at the center of this tradition, the most developed, most specific, most personalized of the Irish death omens. She's not just a sign to interpret. She's a character, a being with history and identity. Ireland changed. Modernity arrived. Did Bean-Sidhe and her fellow omens die out? Not entirely. Reports continued well into the 20th century. Bean-Sidhe accounts continued throughout the 20th century, sometimes in surprising places, adapting to modern contexts. Kilkenny, 1938. Near an old castle, multiple local residents reported hearing sounds of weeping and mourning over one night. Investigation found no one there. No wake was in progress. The next morning, the castle's caretaker was found dead in his cottage. He died in his sleep during the night when the weeping was heard. Multiple witnesses heard the same thing. The death followed within hours. The victim was the caretaker of an old castle, someone connected to ancient Irish heritage. The case was reported in local newspapers and became part of regional folklore. County Down, 1948. A farmer working late reported hearing keening sounds carrying across the land. He couldn't identify the source, but was disturbed enough to mention it to his family when he returned home. That same night, his elderly mother died peacefully in her sleep. The family immediately understood what the farmer had heard. Dublin in the 1970s is particularly interesting because Dublin is urban, modern. Yet hospital staff at one facility began telling stories about a grey woman who appeared in corridors or near certain rooms before terminal patients died. The staff, many educated nurses with medical training, couldn't explain the phenomenon. This urban medical context shows how adaptable the belief could be. The Bean-Sidhe wasn't confined to castles and countryside. She could appear in hospitals, walking modern corridors. The setting changed, but the core belief remained intact. Donegal, 1989. A driver on a rural road at night heard a sudden shriek near the roadside. Startled, he lost control momentarily, but regained it. Moments later, he encountered another vehicle in the wrong lane. The collision killed his passenger. The driver later told authorities he believed the shriek was the Bean-Sidhe, warning him of the death about to occur. This case shows how Bean-Sidhe belief could affect people's psychological processing of traumatic events. The driver needed to make sense of a sudden, horrible accident. The Bean-Sidhe belief provided that framework. He'd been warned. The death was predicted, was part of a larger pattern. Belfast, 1998. During a radio call-in show, multiple listeners phoned in to report hearing identical cries near a cemetery the previous night. No funeral had occurred. At least a dozen people reported hearing the sounds, all describing them the same way. The next day, a funeral was held at that cemetery for a prominent member of an old Ulster family. This case demonstrates how modern media could spread and validate Bean-Sidhe beliefs. The radio show allowed multiple witnesses to compare notes, to realize they hadn't been alone in their experience. The Irish Folklore Department has archives containing over 100 modern testimonies from the 20th century. These range from first-hand accounts to second-hand stories, from rural experiences to urban ones. What's particularly interesting in these modern accounts is how often people struggle to reconcile belief with skepticism. Many accounts include phrases like, "I don't usually believe in such things," but these qualifiers show people trying to maintain modern rational identities while acknowledging experiences that don't fit modern rational frameworks. This tension between tradition and modernity characterizes much 20th century Irish experience. Ireland modernized rapidly, especially in the latter half of the century. But modernization didn't erase cultural memory or traditional belief systems. People held multiple worldviews simultaneously. Some modern accounts involve people who experienced something they couldn't explain, researched Irish folklore to understand it, and only then discovered the Bean-Sidhe tradition. The experience came first, the cultural framework second. Technology didn't kill the Bean-Sidhe. In some ways, it enabled new forms of the belief. Stories could spread via telephone, radio, television, and eventually the internet. Someone could post about hearing the Bean-Sidhe online and receive dozens of responses from others claiming similar experiences. The 20th century also saw Irish emigration continuing on a massive scale. Millions left Ireland for Britain, America, Australia, and they took their folklore with them. The Bean-Sidhe travelled with emigrants, crossing oceans, adapting to new landscapes, becoming part of Irish identity in exile. Between the Great Famine that began in 1845 and the early 20th century, millions of Irish people left Ireland, mostly for North America, but also for Britain, Australia, New Zealand. They left carrying very little materially, but they carried their culture, their stories, their beliefs. 18th and 19th century shipping logs occasionally include strange entries. Woman heard crying on deck before storm death. Bean, wailing sounds during night. Passenger O'Brien died the following morning. These brief notations show that Bean-Sidhe beliefs travelled literally with emigrants. The conditions on emigrant ships were often horrific. Disease spread rapidly. Deaths were common. Fear and grief permeated these voyages. In such conditions, hearing strange sounds, seeing ambiguous figures would hardly be surprising. When Irish emigrants heard crying or wailing on these ships, the Bean-Sidhe explanation was immediately available. She'd followed them from Ireland. That continuity was comforting. However frightening the Bean-Sidhe might be, she represented connection to home, to tradition. In the United States, Irish communities maintained their cultural identity partly through shared folklore. In cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, stories circulated. The Bean-Sidhe appeared in Irish neighborhoods, cried before deaths in Irish families. Reports exist of people in America hearing the Bean-Sidhe or experiencing death omens, and then later receiving news that a family member in Ireland had died around the same time. These cases were taken as proof that the Bean-Sidhe operated across distances. The word Banshee itself entered American English during this period of mass immigration. By the late 19th century, American newspapers used Banshee as a synonym for bad omen or harbinger of tragedy. The term became detached from its specific Irish context and became a general metaphor. In Britain, particularly in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow, with large Irish populations, the Bean-Sidhe maintained a stronger connection to her traditional Irish roots. These communities were closer to Ireland, maintained more direct ties. Scottish-Irish immigrants blended Bean-Sidhe traditions with Highland Scottish folklore about the Bean-Sidhe. The two figures were similar enough to merge easily. Australia and New Zealand received significant Irish immigration. These distant colonies became new Irish homelands. The Bean-Sidhe travelled to the Southern Hemisphere. What's particularly interesting about diaspora, Bean-Sidhe beliefs, is how they functioned as markers of Irish identity. Claiming your family had a Bean-Sidhe was a way of asserting your Irishness, your connection to the old country. It said, we're not just immigrants, we're part of something old and meaningful. This identity function became especially important for second and third generation immigrants who'd never seen Ireland. Learning the family's Bean-Sidhe stories provided connection to Irish ancestry. Some families maintained Bean-Sidhe traditions with remarkable consistency across generations in the diaspora. Fourth or fifth generation Irish Americans who'd never been to Ireland still knew their family had a Bean-Sidhe, still told stories about when she'd appeared. The belief also changed in the diaspora. It became more static, more frozen. Emigrant communities often preserved traditions in older forms. The diaspora created time capsules of folklore. The Bean-Sidhe's spread through the diaspora meant she entered dialogue with other supernatural traditions. In America, she existed alongside Native American spirits, African American folklore, European folk beliefs from other immigrant groups. By the 20th century, the Bean-Sidhe had become global. She appeared in literature written by diaspora Irish authors. She appeared in songs and poems celebrating Irish heritage. She became a symbol. The internet age has created new forms of diaspora connection. Online forums where people of Irish descent discuss their heritage include Bean-Sidhe threads, where people share family stories, compare experiences. What the diaspora spread teaches us is that folklore is remarkably portable and adaptable. The Bean-Sidhe didn't need Irish mist and ancient castles to survive. She needed only belief, community, and the universal human experiences of death and grief. Having travelled through her history and spread, we need to ask, what does she mean now? The Bean-Sidhe remains absolutely central to Irish folklore and cultural identity. Ask anyone anywhere in the world to name an Irish supernatural figure, and the Banshee is likely to be the first name they provide. She's achieved that rare status of transcending her origins to become a cultural icon. In Ireland itself, the Bean-Sidhe occupies complex cultural space. For some, especially in rural areas and among older generations, she remains a living belief. For others, especially urban, younger, more secular Irish people, she's a relic of the past. For many, she exists somewhere between these poles. Irish literature has embraced the Bean-Sidhe enthusiastically. William Butler Yeats used her repeatedly in his work. Yeats was deeply invested in Irish folklore and mythology, seeing them as sources of authentic Irish culture. For Yeats, the Bean-Sidhe wasn't just a ghost story. She was a symbol of Irish identity itself. Lady Gregory also wrote extensively about the Bean-Sidhe. Her folklore collections preserved numerous accounts. She understood that folklore wasn't just entertainment. It was the cultural memory of a people. Moving into the 20th century, poets like Seamus Heaney continued engaging with Irish folklore, though often more critically. Heaney grew up in rural Northern Ireland where these traditions were still alive. But he also had modern education and a more sceptical worldview. Contemporary Irish writers continue to return to the Bean-Sidhe. She appears in novels, short stories, poems, plays, films. Sometimes she's treated traditionally. Sometimes she's reimagined, updated, made contemporary. This literary presence keeps the Bean-Sidhe alive in cultural consciousness. Each generation encounters her through tradition and through the works of previous generations. The Bean-Sidhe has also entered popular culture in ways that sometimes simplify her. She appears in horror films, usually reduced to a scary, screaming woman. She appears in fantasy novels and role-playing games. She appears in television shows. Modern Irish idiom preserves the Bean-Sidhe in everyday speech. The Banshee cried last night is still used metaphorically to indicate tragedy or disaster, even by people who don't literally believe in her. Language preserves folklore even after literal belief has faded. Tourism has also adopted the Bean-Sidhe. Visitors to Ireland encounter her in museum exhibits, on ghost tours, in souvenir shops. This commercialization troubles some people, but tourism also spreads cultural knowledge. Folklorists and anthropologists continue studying the Bean-Sidhe, analyzing what she reveals about Irish culture, oral tradition, belief systems. She remains academically interesting precisely because she's so rich, so complex. The Bean-Sidhe serves multiple symbolic functions in contemporary culture. She represents mourning and the importance of grief. In a world that often tries to minimize or rush through grief, the Bean-Sidhe insists that mourning matters, that death deserves to be marked with emotion and ritual. She represents loyalty and connection across generations. The Bean-Sidhe doesn't abandon families. She doesn't forget. She maintains her vigil century after century. She represents Irish identity itself, particularly for diaspora communities. Claiming connection to the Bean-Sidhe tradition is a way of claiming Irishness. She represents the relationship between Ireland and death, which has been fraught throughout history. Ireland has experienced so much death: famine, war, emigration. The Bean-Sidhe acknowledges that, gives it form. She represents the survival of pre-Christian belief within a Christian culture. For people interested in Ireland's pagan past, the Bean-Sidhe is evidence that the old ways didn't completely die. Folklorists view the Bean-Sidhe as an embodiment of cultural memory, particularly memory of grief. Every culture develops ways to process collective trauma and loss. The Bean-Sidhe is Ireland's way. The legend persists in contemporary paranormal reports across Ireland and the diaspora. People still claim to hear her, to see her. These reports appear on paranormal websites, in local newspapers, in social media posts. Songs preserve the Bean-Sidhe in Irish culture. Traditional ballads mention her. Contemporary folk songs reference her. Music is an incredibly powerful vehicle for cultural transmission. Films both preserve and transform the Bean-Sidhe. Irish films treating her seriously serve preservation functions. International horror films serve different functions, spreading recognition even if they get the details wrong. The Bean-Sidhe endures because she addresses permanent human concerns. Death isn't going away. Grief isn't going away. As long as humans die and humans mourn, figures like the Bean-Sidhe will have relevance. She also endures because she's genuinely evocative and powerful as a symbol and story. A woman who cries for the dead before they die, who mourns what hasn't yet happened, who bridges the worlds of living and dead. That's compelling. What can we learn from over 1,000 years of Bean-Sidhe tradition? Folklore isn't static. It evolves constantly, adapts to new circumstances. Living traditions change. Belief is complicated. People can hold multiple, sometimes contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Human belief doesn't follow strict logical rules. Culture travels. The Bean-Sidhe crossed oceans, survived transplantation, adapted to new contexts while maintaining core identity. Folklore serves practical psychological purposes. The Bean-Sidhe helps people process death, maintain identity, feel connected to ancestors and community. She does work. That's why she persists. The past isn't dead. The Bean-Sidhe connects 21st century Irish people to their medieval and pre-Christian ancestors. That connection matters. The Bean-Sidhe ultimately teaches us about ourselves, about how humans use stories and beliefs to make sense of experiences that might otherwise overwhelm us. Death is incomprehensible. Grief is almost unbearable. But if there's a woman from the other world watching, if she cries for us before we go, if our death matters enough for supernatural mourning, then perhaps we can face what's coming with more courage, more meaning, more grace. The Bean-Sidhe persists because humans persist. And as long as we're here, we'll need ways to face death, honor grief, and find meaning in loss.